Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Rabbi Scheer, my friend Andrew Scheer, uh, currently the rabbi of the Japanese Jewish community based in Tokyo. Um, as always, I'm going to start by saying how we met, and then really it's going to be a conversation with Rabbi Scheer about his background, the stage of his rabbinical career, and what took him to Japan most recently, and what it's like in Japan now. So we met because we are exact contemporaries at Yeshivat Chovei Torah. We were first years together. We graduated together. We learned in the same yeshiva for 4 years. And actually, my major memory of his contribution to the yeshiva was to really impress a certain atmosphere of respect. He was very particular that when the teachers, the rabbis came in, we should stand up as a mark of respect for them and their Torah, and it was really an enhancement of the atmosphere of the yeshiva, and something I was very grateful for. I think we went with actually Rabbi Phil Kaplan, we all know and love, off to a military base for Hanukkah one year. I remember that as an outing from the yeshiva, and then we all went in our different directions. So first of all, Rabbi Scheer, Andrew, thank you for joining our community, and maybe just start by telling us about your early background, your family background, and your childhood and upbringing.
Sure. Thank you so much, Birshut Harav and Birshut HaKahal. It's a big zechus for me to be on the call with so many of you in what I've heard is a lovely community, really wonderful community down in Sydney that, when COVID restrictions ease and everything else, I would love to visit in person. So very much looking forward to that. And of course, when our own COVID restrictions ease, you're all welcome to visit us in Tokyo as well. So to answer Ben's question, I'm from a place called Woodmere, New York, located in the Five Towns. And I'll sort of go out from there. I see some nodding. Nassau County, New York, not far from JFK Airport. Referred to as a golden ghetto, quite a Jewish neighborhood. I went to Jewish day school my entire life, Orthodox Jewish day school, but even the public school was something like 90% Jewish. So a pretty Hamish atmosphere to grow up in. No want for kosher food. I mean, 3 or 4 kosher groceries, hypermarkets. I don't know if that's what they're called. Plenty of restaurants, everything else. I really had everything right at my fingertips, including shuls and shtibels, breakaways of breakaways. That was a yearly occurrence that would take place. So that was sort of upbringing I had. My mother's side were very Amerikanischer, American Jews who had come over first, second wave migration, figured late 19th, early 20th century. And on my father's side, I'm descended from Holocaust survivors, one of whom was on Schindler's List. He was a Schindler Jew. So I grew up, typical modern Orthodox upbringing as far as that goes. One of the most interesting parts, though, I was in a very Ashkenazi framework that's on the South Shore of Long Island. And for high school, I went to North Shore Hebrew Academy, which is overwhelmingly Persian and Bukharian. And that was not a branch of Judaism. I shouldn't say Judaism, of the Jewish people, that I was very familiar with. But one thing that really impressed me with those communities was that they didn't divide themselves denominationally. That was the first time I'd ever seen that. Whether somebody was frum or less frum, more observant, they didn't. They said, no, he's Persian, he's Syrian, he's Bukharian, he's the family, they are who they are. So that was quite different than what I'd grown up with, which was very sort of more strict denominationalism. Any event. Went off to study for a year in Israel in Yeshivat Shari Mevaseret Zion, came back to New York, went to NYU where I got a degree in Jewish history, first class honors, I think, which is, no, I'm sorry, Ben, I got a gentleman's third, right? Is that what it's called? From NYU. After that, I went to teach English in Japan. Fascinating experience, a lot of Aussies here on working holiday visas. I don't know in the Jewish community if it's so popular, but fairly common, pretty popular thing to do. I think after people graduate from college, they go teach English abroad, which brought me to Japan. And on Sundays, I came here to the Jewish community of Japan. It's a center that exists from the 1950s. We're in our newest incarnation, which opened in 2009. And I taught the second graders, and I loved it. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I'd taken the LSAT. I'd done, reasonably well, but teaching here at this Jewish community really made me want to be a rabbi, because there's such a thirst for Jewish connection here and Jewish knowledge, but it's a bit of a midbar. We don't, if I were to put out an ad for for Sunday school teachers, I wouldn't get many applicants. That people just don't have the knowledge here in that way. People who come here are here to work, right? They're here to work for Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or, lawyers, expats, what have you. So anyway, I did that. And then I went to Chovevei, where I had the privilege of, I don't think we were ever chavrusas, were we? Once in a while, if my guy was gone or your guy was gone, but we steiged together. We learned. It was quite nice. Oh, and one thing I should just mention this very briefly. Tomorrow is a big anniversary in the Japanese calendar. It's not a holiday. It's a commemoration of March 11th, the tsunami and the earthquake, which struck the northeast region of Japan in Fukushima, Tohoku. I'm sure you remember it, the nuclear disaster. So I, with the yeshiva's permission, I came back here to help lead the Siddharim and to bring some kosher Passover food for the community here. That was while I was in Chovevei. And following Chovevei, I was in the Army Reserve with none other than your former Chazan, which was another zechut. It was very nice. I worked on Rikers Island for the Department of Correction. I'm happy to speak about that a little bit more at length. And then finally wound up back in, and then I was also a hospital chaplain at the VA, which is sort of like a repatriation hospital. That's what they're called, right? Like sort of hospital for veterans. And eventually, Japan's a very seductive place, so it brought me back to the Stellar. This is my first Stellar here in Tokyo. And I think I'm missing one thing. Ben, what am I missing? What did I leave out? Where did we go together? And I'm sorry, Rabbi Elton, I'll call you by your title. We had another zechus to go to Nairobi, Kenya together.
I was just on mute. That's why I wasn't answering.
Oh, okay. Or we've been trying to, get it out of our memories.
Two memorable weeks in Nairobi.
Absolutely. So that's me in a nutshell, and happy to speak, more at length. We could talk, we could chat. I have a couple of presentations of some of the things I've done.
Great.
And you should all know you're very fortunate to have Rabbi Elton. He was really one of the stars at Yeshiva. So just great to be reconnecting with you as well.
Oh, thank you very much. Can I ask you more about the two elements of chaplaincy that you were involved in before Japan? Say a bit more about army chaplaincy and the opportunities and challenges and the people you met and the environment you worked in. And I think most interestingly about what it's like being a prison chaplain.
Everyone always wants to know about prison. Not the people who have been there. They're not as interested. But yeah, so I'll answer about the army first. I'd mentioned before about the Bukharians and the Persians who I'd interacted with, and that's really a model for my rabbinate. Where I was growing up on the South Shore of Long Island, there were enough Jews. We had the privilege of saying, I'm center left, I'm center right, I'm yeshivish. When I got to the army, those delineations and demarcations were meaningless, right? Everyone who was there was Jewish, or they weren't Jewish, and they were just sort of curious. A lot of people had grown up. I don't know if this is just an American Jewish thing, but they thought that Jews had horns on their heads. And they didn't mean it in an anti-Semitic way. They really genuinely were just ignorant that they'd never met a Jewish person before. So my work in the army spanned a few different places. So I did my basic course at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. A very big, there are Ohev Yisraels there. One of the things that I found being in the army is that non-Jews respect Jews who respect Judaism. So because I was, sort of outwardly frum, they understood that. They understood that more than some of the other rabbis who were, I don't even want to actually go further on that. But if I said that I needed off for a holiday, they really respected it. They thought it was a good thing. If I had a Jewish commander who was not so frum, that actually was more trouble. But if I had a frum Southern Baptist, then he said, of course, it's your religion. God has instructed you or commanded you that you have to take off. Of course, you have to be off. I never encountered any anti-Semitism, nothing, a couple of ignorance here and there, but nothing too bad. And one of the other things, probably the most interesting thing I did when I was in the Army, I worked at West Point, the United States Military Academy. That's where Rabbi Elton and I went up for Hanukkah. Little story about your rabbi. There were about 30 of us, including the Jewish chaplain, who's a frum guy, he's Sephardi, Chaplain Susan. There was myself and a couple of other rabbinical students. Your rabbi was the only one who knew Mao's Tzor by heart. If you recall, remember we had the menorah outside? So we were all very impressed with your knowledge that day. Interesting thing, not far from West Point is a massive Jewish community called Monsey. In Kiryas Yoel, you might be familiar with Kiryas Yoel. It's the closest thing America has to a shtetl, right? The signs are in Yiddish. And whenever I went there with my Army uniform, I was expecting, people to throw rocks at me. And it was just the opposite. I was never even allowed to pay for anything. They saw a Jewish guy with the kippah in uniform, and they loved it. So I really just had a very warm reception there. The most interesting thing I think I did when I was in the Army was I led a birthright trip of Jewish cadets from the United States Military Academy, midshipmen from the Naval Academy. They're called Zoomies from the Air Force, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine, and ROTC, which is military training while people are in college. And I led them on a birthright trip to Israel, which they loved. And one of the things that was the nicest was, there's this thing called the Mifgash, where the Israeli soldiers, which are just 18 to 21-year-olds, right? They meet these Americans, and there's this fetishization of the Israeli soldier. But on our bus, they were comparing and contrasting what weapon systems they used. And it was really a meeting of equals, which was wonderful. And we had at least one from the Naval Academy who resigned his commission and joined Sahal, joined the IDF. So it was pretty interesting work there. Also had a lot of folks who frankly had no idea they were Jewish, which is very strange, right? They had a Jewish parent, a mom. This happened exactly in one scenario. Somebody said, oh yeah, I thought I'd come because my grandmother is Jewish and I've never been to synagogue, and I wanted to explore that aspect of myself. And I said, well, which grandmother? She said, oh, my mom's mom. I said, well, I have news for you. You're Jewish. You're just as Jewish as me or anyone else who is here. Moments like that. People who, they were really just, their connection to Judaism was so tenuous. And I like that it was my responsibility that I could be there for them. That there was nobody else stepping up to serve them, right? And my opportunity to bring them back into the fold, to makarev them, was one shot. These were not people who were coming to shul every week. So for me, it was just wonderful to be able to serve in that way, and also to demonstrate that military service is both a Jewish value and an American value, that you can be both, that you don't have to choose. One of the things that really pained me was people would say, oh, why didn't you join Sahal? And I have as much respect as you could have for people who joined Sahal and joined it from overseas. But I said, yeah, it's a little bit of a busha. It's if we're not joining the American military, which my grandfather served in the Battle of the Bulge and my father-in-law served in Vietnam, I said, it was like an ill-fitting coat. It was a bit uncomfortable for me. So I felt like I wanted to do my part in that way. To move the conversation a little forward, do you want to hear about the prison, what goes on in the prisons?
Yes, please, especially Jelaine Maxwell, if you can.
Oh yeah. This is not a joke. I offered to officiate Jeffrey Epstein's funeral. That almost happened.
Wow.
That almost happened. Yeah, his friend called me. He said, we can't find a rabbi. I said, you're in New York. I said, well, I said, you're probably not paying enough. That's the issue. But anyway, the Bureau of Prisons had their own rabbi, and it was taken care of that way. But anyway, so I like to make a little diuk that I didn't work in a prison as far as prisons go. I want to make a distinction between jails and prisons. So jail is the county lockup. It's actually, it's very interesting. The Torah doesn't talk about prison, right, as a punishment. You could read through the Gemara this way and that, and you'd never find it. However, I forget exactly which parsha it's in, but I think it's maybe end of Shemot. It might have actually been a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, there's a man who is breaking sticks, right, on Shabbat, and they say, well, you can't do that. And he doesn't stop, so they put him aside until they figure out what to do with him. That's jail. Jail is the person has been caught doing something that they ought not have been doing, and they're put in jail, and they can be there for a couple of hours, they can be there for a couple of years, if it's a particularly serious charge like murder, rape, something like that, even a very, terrible burglary. But then eventually they have their trial and they're sentenced to prison, in which case they'll go somewhere else for some determinate period of time or indeterminate, or they'll be released. So Rikers Island, where I worked, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, it's the New York City Department of Correction county lockup, except the county is New York City, which is a city of 8 million people. It holds about 15,000 inmates. The numbers always, I'll ask, if people are muted, I'll ask you, Rabbi Elton, when do you think the numbers go up on Rikers Island?
Probably after public holidays, when people have been drinking and driving. And
that's fair. Season, what season do you think the numbers go up?
Probably summer. You want to go out and burgle things in the summer.
Lahefech, winter.
Oh.
It's really, the New York City Department of Correction, Rikers Island, is the largest homeless shelter in the city of New York. It's the largest hospital system in the city of New York. It's really the largest social service agency. It feeds more people every day than all the soup kitchens combined. Quite common that somebody would come into the custody of the Department of Correction just because they wanted a bed. It was called 3 hots and a cot. 3 hot meals and a place to rest. That was safe-ish, right? Safer than many of the homeless shelters, for sure. I'll give you an example. There was a Jewish guy who was raised Jewish, right? I think he'd gone to Sunday school, he'd had a bar mitzvah, whatever it is. And I asked him what he was doing there, and he said that unfortunately, his mother was nifter. His mother had passed away. And he just couldn't deal with the stress of everything that came with his mother having passed away. So he, sorry, that's my WhatsApp. I'll close that. So we purchased a beer. In America, you can't drink in public. He purchased a beer. He was an alcoholic. He didn't drink. He spilled it out, and he waited on a subway platform. Open carry, it's called. And a cop came and he said, hey, you got to throw that out. And he said, no, you need to take me to jail. He said, I don't want to take you to jail. He said, no, you need to take me to jail. He said, this thing is empty. It's not even. He said, please, I'm begging you, take me to jail. And the police officer did. And he said, I knew that it was exactly 1 week based on the charge, based on the court system. So that's the amount of time that I needed to get myself right. So I asked, so I said, you're sitting Shiva right now, is what you're telling me. And the answer was yes. He needed a space to be around people, right? Except he was so disconnected. He was a drug addict. He was disconnected from his family. So this was the place that he felt most comfortable sitting Shiva. One of the things that I say about Rikers Island and just jails in general, I'm sure it's the same in Australia as it is in New York. For people who have never been incarcerated, I think most of those people imagine that they'll be fine, right? They'll bail out, they'll hire a lawyer, whatever it is. But for the people who are in it, they can't imagine life outside. It's quite difficult. The number of people who go into jail once and never come back, it's infinitesimal. It's a bit of a revolving door once they're in the system. So I saw my mission while I was there, not to makari people to put on tefillin, right? I'm not a Lubavitcher. There's plenty of Lubavitchers doing amazing work, but it was just to sit with them and to try to find out the root cause of their drug problem, of whatever it was. most painful phone call I had to make was to a parent of a 19-year-old drug addict who was facing, every time he'd bail out, he'd get another charge. So he was facing 3 charges in 3 jurisdictions. He'd been arrested in New York, New Jersey, and Westchester County. And the judges were all fighting because they had to figure out court dates. And I had to call and convince the father not to bail out the son, which was very difficult, right? It was difficult for the father, it was difficult for me. The son wasn't happy with me. He didn't come to Jewish service much after that. But yeah, I mean, prisons, it's a very real place. There's aspects of it that I miss. There's no cell phones, or there shouldn't be. So I was very present with my inmates in a way that's very hard when I'm with my congregants outside of Shabbos, obviously. But yeah, in a way, I saw the greatest acts of humanity. There was an inmate whose father passed away, Erev Pesach. It's coming up on Erev Pesach. And he was sitting Shiva. His family came to visit in the visit area. And I arranged that both the officers and the inmates, they came and they paid Shiva calls in the visit area of the prison, or of the jail, I should say. Tearing Kriya. Sorry.
I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts, or what thoughts developed about the American jail and prison system and the social security system and the welfare system in America? Did you come to conclusions about its dysfunctionality or functionality, or did you not have wider thoughts? It was basically about the people in front of you.
So it was a little bit of both. The reason why that it's a difficult question for me to answer, the people who work in the jails, we don't choose who gets arrested, right? We're stuck with them. The police officers are the ones who are deciding who to arrest, and the district attorneys are the ones deciding who to charge, and the legislature is the one that's coming up with the criminal code. So we were really like we had the least control of anyone in the system, right? We didn't decide who we would admit. We didn't decide when people would leave. The population was overwhelmingly Black. There's no way around that. It was funny because there were a lot of the Jews were white collar criminals, and they would come to me. They'd say, "We're so worried, we don't know," and they would call me beforehand, right? They knew that what their surrender date was after they'd been sentenced. I said, "You're like an oddity, okay? You're going to be like a zebra in the zoo. They're not even going to know what to do with you. Your physical safety is not going to be in any, you're not going to be in harm's way whatsoever." And nobody ever was. America has a very big drug problem, right? The vast majority of the inmates that I served, including Jews, because I served anyone who identified as Jewish, which was about 10% of the people who were, 10% of whom were actually Jewish. They were gang members. These were hardened gang members. One of the things that I struggled with was, because I was, brought up, I went to, liberal universities and all that. I said, "Oh, these poor babies, miskin, I can't believe they're victims of their circumstance." And I would say I spent the first year and a half having convinced myself that all these guys were innocent. None of these guys had any agency. Nobody, the crimes they committed, they were crimes of opportunity or circumstance, this and that. And it was a lot of the officers who came from similar backgrounds who tried to get that out of me. They said, "I came from the same project. I went to the same school. This guy was in my class. Why am I here and he's there?" So a lot of that, like that white savior, right, mentality that's also very common in America. It's funny, it didn't fly with the overwhelmingly Black correction officers and administrators. They thought that I was like a bleeding heart, something like that. But it's difficult. It's people who were, there were a lot of people who were born into the system. One of the most difficult cases was somebody who was quite literally born into foster care. He was taken out of the hospital and immediately placed in the foster care system, never had stable housing. How does somebody like that learn? How does somebody like that do homework, right? So I think, America could use a much stronger safety net. There's no question about that. It comes right up against that, American pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the Protestant work ethic, all of that. But yeah, I thought that the jails, believe it or not, they were much more compassionate places than people gave them credit for. I like to quote our morning Seder Rebbe, Rabbi Katz. One of the things that I want to accomplish is I want to problematize your conception of jails and prisons and everything else. They're much more human places than you'd expect. All the people who work there aren't monsters. All the people who are incarcerated, far from it, they're not monsters. They understand loyalty in a way that I think can be missing on the outside. Well, really, because their lives depend on it, right? But yeah, so for me, it was a wonderful thing that I got to work there, to be able to call a parent of an inmate and to tell them how their son, their daughter is doing. To me, it was something I really enjoyed that I got to do it.
And how long were you working in the prison system?
It was just about 4 years.
So it's a serious amount of time. It's not dipping your toe into the water. It's really immersion for that length of time.
Yeah, and sometimes people would want to convert, and we'd say, we don't have a mikveh. I'm very sorry. Talking about immersion. Yeah. We would also say it was hard enough for me to help this inmate tear kriya. I said, doing a bris is out of the question.
And were you there for Pesach and Seder and things like that?
I was there. My entry point was through leading Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur services. Talk about tshuva in a jail. Talk about Avinu Malkeinu, and really handing over that our lives are in somebody else's hands, a judge's hands, right? So these were concepts that were not foreign to them. I haven't had as meaningful a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur since. I don't think I ever will.
I heard there was still. I heard in Rikers there might still be some religious one-upmanship going on. I don't daven like this. I don't daven with him. I always get the verse of Leah on Yom Kippur.
Mafter Yonah, how do you not give it to him? He's a big macher. This is how I describe the Jews of Rikers Island, okay? They're broken up into three pretty distinct categories. A third of them were white collar. Accountants, lawyers. Lawyers were always in jail for the same thing, commingling money. So they had an escrow account that they dipped into. It was always, and interestingly, many of the white collar criminals were big donors to Jewish causes. And that's not what put them there, right? They had a lot of other demands on their time and on their money. But I remember one, he said, look, I always donate $100,000 to the yeshiva every year. And just because my business goes down doesn't mean they expect any less, doesn't mean they need it any less. So there's sort of like a mental gymnastics they get. And then eventually, I had one lawyer tell me, he said he's never had less stress in his life than when he was in jail. He said, they bring me my paper in the morning, they bring me my coffee. He said, I would never choose it, but it's not the worst thing. He said, I would have never slowed down. He said, one of the reasons I'm here is I couldn't slow down. I needed a break. So a third of them are white collar, okay? A third are, unfortunately, drug addicts. And when I say drug addicts, I mean hard drugs like heroin, or including from the frum community. Unfortunately, he was nifter, much, much too young. I had one inmate, he was in his mid-20s. He knew 2/3 of Shas Baal Peh. 2/3 of the Gemara. Anything. You would start a line, you would tell him, I'm 5 lines from the bottom, Yevamos, and he would just off to the races. Incredible mind, like an Eloi, really. We were learning with him, and when you learn Gemara, sometimes you're flipping back and forth, and you're in the Mordechai, and you wish you had more than 5 fingers, right? And he would say, Rabbi, do you have the Ritva? Where's your copy of the Ritva? I said, you're on Rikers Island. I don't have a copy of the Ritva. He says, what kind of rabbi? You don't have a copy of the... So you had, unfortunately, people like that as well, that drugs were just were ruining their lives. And a third were Russian, okay? They were from the former Soviet Union. They were Soviet Jews. They were new immigrants, and they were getting into all kinds of trouble: Medicare fraud, Medicaid fraud, Russian mafia, Israeli mafia, Russian-Israeli mafia, that kind of thing. But I've never seen the achdus, the togetherness that I've seen on Rikers Island. I had a Hasidic Gabbai who was a Pupa Chassid. I had an Israeli Chazan, and
Who was
mixed
inmates?
match. Yeah, inmates, sure.
Wow.
Yeah, and just a mishmash. The one thing, this I won't quiz you on, Rabbi Elton, but there was one type of inmate who I really couldn't serve, Jewish guy. Anyone who was Masari of Levo Ladin, anyone who had an active seruv against them that they were refusing to give their wife a get. I had at least 4 inmates like that were held, it was called a civil area, that they were in violation of their divorce agreements. One of the conditions of the divorce agreement was that they would give their wife a get. And they'd done everything else, the custody, the money. For whatever reason, this one little thing, no, it's not so little, right? To the women, it's everything. And to all of us, it should be everything. I wouldn't give them an aliyah. I couldn't deprive them. I couldn't deny them service. But I preferred to give somebody who I had like a chashash, is this guy really Jewish? To give him, not shishi, but, hagba, whatever it was. I tried to interact with those inmates as little as possible.
And they were in jail because they refused to give a get.
Exactly right.
That's extraordinary that somebody prefers to go to Rikers than to give a get. That's amazing.
They viewed it as like suffering for Shem Shemayim. that was the sickness in their heads. They viewed it as, I'm doing God's will. Like this is suffering that's going to save me, suffering in Olam Haba, and I'm upholding a Jewish value. Some people were trying to use it as leverage in ongoing custody proceedings. I made a big mistake one time. Many of you might have heard of, I think it was in 2013, there was a rabbi named Mendel Epstein, who he could get your get.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't ask how. You were better off not knowing how he obtained the gets, but he was getting gitten in a way that maybe the Rambam would have. Maybe he was being very somech on the Rambam. He was relying on the Rambam for this. Anyway, he was using violence, things that you really shouldn't do. And people came to the Jewish service because they got the paper. They said, "Well, what's going on?" And I didn't even talk so much about him. I started lambasting men who refused to give their wife a get. That I think they're the lowest, and I refused to serve them. And then there was an inmate in the front who said, "It's really not that simple, Rabbi." And I said, "No, it is, because it's terrible and the religion shouldn't be used in such a way." And then I remembered that he was accused and later convicted of murdering his wife.
Wow.
That was a real story. That's a real Maisa Shahaya.
Wow.
And I said, "Yeah, maybe it is more complicated. Let's move on. Let's get to Pirkei Avos."
We've had a question. Was it all male on Rikers?
Great question. Overwhelmingly male. So I think there's 12 facilities, 9 of which are on Rikers, and then there's one in Manhattan, one in Brooklyn, and one. Well, this is interesting. It's a prison barge, because any city councilman, any politician who lets a jail be built in their borough is going to be kicked out. So the city of New York's solution to that was to build a prison barge in New Orleans and float it up the eastern seaboard and have it permanently moored to the southern tip of the Bronx. All of those were male facilities, okay? There was one female facility. You might have been watching Inventing Anna on Netflix. It's a wonderful show. You should all watch it. There is one jail for women. Contained within the jail, and this you might find interesting, is a nursery. Because the city of New York, it's a liberal city, despite the number of people it incarcerates, it's a very liberal city. And they want to encourage breastfeeding from the women. So if somebody gets arrested and either their child is below the age of 1, or they're pregnant when they arrive at jail and they give birth at city hospital, and they get to come back with their baby, this nursery, and it received private donations, right? The city didn't pay for everything. It was one of the most beautiful nurseries I've ever seen in my life. You would have never thought that there were no bars, right? There was carpeting, there were elephants on the walls and drafts. It was all it was all quite lovely. But I spoke with one of the correction officers who were, and this was a very plum post if you were a correction officer, right? You didn't have to worry about, I don't know how graphic I want to get, but the inmates would sometimes throw things at the correction officers that they shouldn't have been throwing. Anyway, you didn't have to worry about that. You would have to worry about maybe there was a poopy diaper, and that would be unfortunate. But they said it was quite a difficult assignment on day 366 when they would have to remove the child from the mother's arms, quite literally. So very painful, I mean, it's equal parts painful and sort of beautiful when you see, a woman has everything taken from her, but she's holding her baby. It's quite something.
So let's move to Japan, as you did. How did you become aware that was a vacancy for you in Japan, or for somebody in Japan?
Sure. I was working at the Veterans Affairs Hospital at the time. COVID had not quite started yet. This was January of 2020. This community that I serve, it's a lovely community. It's a wonderful community. It's a bit transient, right? It's more like a college campus. Expats are constantly coming and going, which is good. We get new energy. But anyway, they have a pretty hard time recruiting rabbis to serve here. Lack of kosher food, lack of Jewish infrastructure, right? We're it. I don't like to think of us as a synagogue. We have a sanctuary, right? Where we daven, but we're really like an embassy of Judaism. We're all things Jewish for the people who live in Japan. So because I taught in the Sunday school here, and we have a couple of people who have been here for quite a while. They just reached out to me and they said, the worst 3 words in the English language are rabbinic search committee. It's not fun to be on it. It's not fun to be interviewed with these probas and all of this. They said, we know you. Now, you're still going to have to do 50. They said, normally we would fly you out and we'd feed you and we'd sell you on the beauty of living in Japan. We can't do that because of COVID, but do you want to be on 15 Zoom interviews with the board members? And I said, what could I love more than that? I wasn't looking for a stellar. I wasn't looking for a pulpit to be a synagogue rabbi. I'd interned as a synagogue rabbi in Nashville, Tennessee, and on the Upper East Side. I'd had wonderful experiences. One of the main reasons I wasn't looking for a synagogue right out of yeshiva was because I was still single. And I thought just being, and people who can pull it off, kol hakavod, but to me, being a single pulpit rabbi would have been a little too tricky for me, especially in Japan, because there's not exactly a deep pool to pull from. But anyway, I'd gotten married in 2017, and we had every reason not to go. My wife has a wonderful job as a software engineer. Working in a hospital during COVID in New York in March and April of 2020, I feel guilty, but I feel guilty saying it, but I've never felt more alive. And that chaplaincy really, really meant something, that we were really able to help people. When family members couldn't visit their loved ones in the hospital, I would be there with an iPhone on FaceTime, just so that these family members could see their loved one literally breathe their last breaths many times. And, after a ventilator, I don't want to go too much into that.
Did you catch COVID?
I caught COVID 2 months ago.
Oh, wow.
in America. I was very fortunate that I never caught COVID during the initial wave. My father, who's a physician, Rabbi Elton and I, we would always have these discussions about the NHS versus the American system, because as I'm sure many of you know, Rabbi Elton's father is quite a distinguished physician in the United Kingdom. And my father has a private practice. So I think at our Chag HaSmicha, we were sort of like, you guys fight it out. But anyway.
So how did you manage to avoid getting COVID when you were surrounded by it in hospital? Were you in very protective gear?
Davka, no, because we wanted to make sure that the doctors and the nurses had access to it. Remember, there was a PPE shortage. So maybe it was like being young and stupid a little bit. I tried to take as many precautions as I could. I had an N95 mask that I wore. I mean, I literally had an indentation on the bridge of my nose from wearing it so often. I don't know. It's better lucky than good, I guess. I really couldn't tell you. I was trying to do as much as I could not to go into the rooms, Occasionally, I'd have to go in and say vidui with somebody, right? With a Jewish patient. It was quite difficult. Serving the patients wasn't the hard part. That's right. That was part of what I signed up for. It was serving the doctors and the nurses who were going in every day when people were calling out sick. And then when they would leave, they were being treated as radioactive by everyone else in the city. To wear scrubs at that time on a bus or a train was, it wasn't a pleasant experience. So as difficult as all this sounds, as a chaplain, I felt like I was right in the heart of it. I was right where God wanted me, where the Eibishter wanted me. But Marcia and Jerry Rosenberg, who have been in Tokyo quite a long time, they've been the directors of the Sunday school for 40 plus years. They called and we answered. We had every reason not to go. My wife was 7 months pregnant, on the verge of the 3rd trimester when we flew here. Present. It's not present here. Even in New York, and I remember Rabbi Elton, one of the things that you shared that I was very struck by, you said, I've never been in a place like New York. Tzitzis. People are just wearing their tzitzis. It's an unbelievable thing. I could wear a kapata and a bekasha and a streimel here. And they would just think, okay, it's some weird gaijin, weird foreigner thing that this guy's doing. I never wear a baseball hat. I don't even think about it. I wear my yarmulke everywhere. Never, not once had a problem. It's clean. New York was getting a little gritty for our tastes as it related to, because they'd empty the homeless shelters for COVID. And beyond that, forget about whether it's safe or not, because I'm only I don't know how many centimeters, it's 5 feet 6 inches. And I lived in Manhattan for 15 years. I never had a problem. I worked in the jails for 4 years and I never had a problem. One of the things that really bothered us with thinking about having a baby is there's just homelessness everywhere, and that our son would see us like stepping over somebody or walking around them and, you know, sort of hardening their heart. That was something that we didn't feel comfortable with for our son. So we flew here. There was one moil in Japan. He does kashrus work for the OK, a wonderful guy. He's first cousins with the last Jew of Afghanistan, Zvulun Simantov. Just a little trivia. And he had the bris here. And yeah, Japan, I'm curious if anyone on the call has been here, because, you know, time zone wise, it's very convenient. It's just a wonderful place to live. And that the same, not the same feeling, but a similar feeling that I felt growing up with the Bukharians and on Rikers Island, where there's just a sense of achdus. There's not enough of us to start creating division. It's quite similar in Tokyo, which is one of the reasons why I love being the rabbi of this community.
And so what does your week look like? What does your Shabbos look like in Tokyo?
Sure. So one of the exciting things is I never know when the phone rings, I never know who it is or what they're going to need. We've had people living in rural Hokkaido, which is very northern Japan, who needed a mile for their son. We have people who they need a mezuzah. They're living in Kyushu, right? They're living, and people wind up in Japan for all kinds of reasons. So number one, there's an excitement to it that I never know what the week's going to bring. But in terms of the regularity, a lot of it is frankly social. There's a psychosocial element. People who move here do so, in doing so, they give up their being around friends and being around family. So the synagogue and the JCC, people come here really just to make friends and to talk and to chat. The initial iteration of the JCC was founded by Russian Jews from Vladivostok and who had been in Shanghai in the ghetto. There were 3 requirements to be a member of the JCC. You had to speak Russian, play poker, and I think it was smoke cigars. Those were the 3 requirements of.
That sounds like a great afternoon.
I know. I wish those members were still here. Now they want me to lead services. It's much less pleasant. So our Shabbos is quite nice. We don't get a ton of people. I'm not going to pretend like we have 100 people on a Shabbos. I have to handle all week to get the minyan. we're probably one of the last shuls that has a trichitza. So we have a men's section, a women's section, and a men and women's section together. The mechitzas were present from Chabad, who tried to take over the building 20 years ago. So they left us those gifts, which I'm very happy to use.
Is there also Chabad of Tokyo, or you're the only game in town?
So now you're asking the good questions, Rabbi Elton. There's two Chabads who do not recognize each other. And I know in Australia, Chabad has a very strong presence. I didn't even realize it. I think growing up in America, the world for me ended in New Jersey, really. But I don't like to say that there's three communities. There's one community. We don't have enough Jews for there to be three communities. I was at one of the Chabads. There was a yahrzeit minyan. Somebody had yahrzeit for their mother, so I was the 10th. I made the minyan for that. And 3 weeks before, there was somebody. We're responsible for the cemetery, for the Jewish cemetery. So one of the other guys who had been a Chabad, went to the different Chabad. They needed karka. He wanted to be buried in Japan, so we gave him the karka. We gave him the burial plot. I work with everyone, right? And because I was an English teacher here 13 years ago, I've been to everyone's Seder, right? I've spent Shabbos by everyone. I've made the minyan at so that's my model. And I tell my balabatim, my congregants, if you haven't been to the Chabad, you're actually kind of missing out. I want everyone to have the full Jewish experience when they come to Japan.
It's interesting because there are sizable communities well established in Singapore, in Hong Kong. In some ways, it's surprising that there wasn't a larger and more established community, because it's a very successful city, lots of opportunities for Jews to work and do business and so on. Probably even fewer Jews than there were in Nairobi.
Yeah.
At least Nairobi at its height.
I think they were 10 years too late. Many of you might remember the bubble economy in Japan, when they thought that Japan was just going to eat the world's lunch, right? Real estate prices, and Japan had just had this go. They were going to take over the world. And that bubble burst in the mid-90s. And with it, many of the expat jobs went to Hong Kong and went to Singapore. So our loss was their gain. And then Chabad showed up in the year 2000, when things had already pretty much settled down. When the Great Recession hit in 2008, more jobs left. And in 2011, when the earthquake and tsunami happened, more people left. So the expat community is a shell of what it was.
How's Japan doing in general? Is Japan thriving or still struggling?
The outgoing Israeli ambassador said something very funny in her farewell speech at the embassy. She said, Israelis, we're a small country, but we pretend like we're very big, like we're larger than we are. She said, Japan, you're a country of 120 million people. You're the world's third largest economy, but yet you shirk and you shrink like you're very small. She said, you're big. Remind yourselves that you're big. I wouldn't say it's very stable. It's not growing. It's an aging population. So Japan loses, I think, 1% of its population every year. Just more people are dying than are being born. And there's not a ton of migration. Japan, in many ways, is being, putting on a job advertisement, foreigners need not apply, or that's permitted by law. So net migration is quite low, net immigration, and the Japanese really don't leave so much. They're just sort of happy with how things are. But another reason I should mention why I love living here, it's one of the only cultures I know that has a word for us and then everyone else, right? So we have your Yehudim v'Goyim, there's Jews and non-Jews, Jews and Gentiles. The Japanese have Nihonjin and Gaijin. Nihonjin is Japanese and Gaijin is foreigner. So you're either us, and you could be white, you could be black, you could be Hispanic, you could be Australian from Papua New Guinea. You're not us, okay? You're in this other category. So I like that, and they respect Jews here, and they respect Americans and foreign way of life to a point. They said, as long as you're not trying to convert us, and I said that's not what we're about. I assure you.
We have about 8 or 10 minutes left, so I want to open the floor to anyone else on the call who has a question. I think Ezra will allow people to unmute themselves, and then if anyone has a question, just unmute and ask away.
There. Okay. Can I ask a question?
Please.
Rabbi, where does the funding come from for your organization?
I thought it was coming from you, Rabbi Elton. We didn't talk about an honorarium.
An enormous honorarium.
Completely self-funded. We are one of the very few East Asian cities that has our own building. It's quite, especially non-Chabad. And it's really because of gifts that were made by the founders of the community. You might have heard of Shaul Eisenberg, who founded Israel Corporation. He donated a tremendous amount of money. It was him and really, I would say, Michael Kogan. Remember Space Invaders, the arcade game?
No.
Japanese company owned by a Jewish guy, Taito. So we've had a few people who gifted us this amazing piece of land. And the people who are the members now, we have about 100 member unit families. I will say when I got here, it was 85. It wasn't me. It was so we're very fortunate in that we're growing, but it's completely self-funded. We don't even really do grant writing because it's the people who live here, people move here for work. So the people who live here are fairly well off, and we figure that the World Jewish Congress, that they can help the former Soviet Union, whatever it is. So we try to be a net donor more than a net recipient of Jewish communal funds.
Amazing. Lynn, yes, just unmute yourself, Lynn. And ask away. While Lynn works out about the unmuting, David and Anna have asked about your Japanese language skills.
Nihongo ga skoshi wakarimasu. Which is
Well,
to say,
but what about your Japanese?
Oh yeah, I've used all my Japanese. So Japanese is not a very portable language, okay? If you're in Japan, it's useful, but outside of Japan, it's really not that useful. Before our son Asher was born, we were learning and we were getting deeper into it. But once he came around,
who has time?
Yeah, we hope that he's going to submit our taxes in 3-4 years from now. I'll say, Asher, what is this deduction? What's the immigration authority trying to tell us? So if we stay, then maybe he'll help us. But for the purposes of the job, I would have said for the purpose of the job, it wasn't so useful, except we've had a few people who have wanted to convert to Judaism for whatever reason. Sometimes because they're dating somebody, sometimes just because they're interested and for whatever reason, they've been led to Yiddishkeit. And I feel terrible that I can't invite them to classes because they don't speak English and our lingua franca is English. And I said, being fluent in English is not a chiyuv in Gior. It's not mandatory in the conversion process. That shouldn't stop somebody's ability to convert. But unfortunately, it does because I can't really help them further. So I'd like to learn Japanese more, but I was hoping that just living here, I would absorb it, but that hasn't happened. There is one thing that I'd like to show you though. So we do have a Bavli that has been translated into the Japanese. Okay, we have a full set. The best-selling book of the 20th century in Japan was written by a man named Fujita Den, who was the only person who's allowed to own franchises of McDonald's at that time in Japan. And it was called The Jewish Way of Doing Business. You can look it up. Best-selling book in 20th century Japan. So there's a philo-Semitism here. There's a wanting to know. That's very exciting. Yes.
I think there was a question from Avril and Joe.
Yeah. About 38 to 40 years ago, outside Kyoto, there was a small community who was run by a priest. extremely pro-Israel. And the community was large enough to even send a choir to Israel to the song competition. And they were singing Yerushalayim Shel Zachar. I wonder if the rabbi would know anything about that community.
Not only do I know the Beit Shalom Choir, they will be performing at our Yom HaShoah event this year.
Fantastic. Very good.
And they performed at the Israeli ambassador's farewell party. So yeah, they're still around and they're great. I heard them when I was an English teacher here and I came in for Yom HaShoah to the JCC. So yeah, they're still around. And I should mention there's another synagogue in Kobe, Japan, that actually predates our community in Tokyo. And they're also, it's very Israeli, a lot of fun, but just a different type of community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
This time for just one more question, if there is. And if there is not.
Diana Marks has a question, Rabbi.
Sorry, Anna.
Oh, hi. There's another book that's been translated. It's the Haggadah. We used to go to Japan quite a lot. And one year we went to a Seder there with our son and a couple of his friends. Mm-hmm. And the Haggadah is translated into Japanese, English, and Hebrew.
I'm literally looking for it. I'm in our library right now.
Yeah. And one thing you didn't mention.
Yeah, here it is.
That's it. And one thing you didn't mention is how fantastic the catering is there. The kosher catering. Do you still do it? We've had meals after Shabbat services. We've had Seder there. We've had Rosh Hashanah here. And the food is outstanding. And the hospitality, like the whole, I don't know if you've been able to do it during COVID, but the whole atmosphere at the meals is fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts. You know, I really have to handle for the minyan every Shabbos. And I wondered, I said, well, what happened? Because I heard that there used to be like the service that you're describing where there was tons of people. They said, oh, well, you know, we cut out Kiddush. I said, you did what? I said, what did you think? Kiddush? That's the huge draw for people. So I've reinstituted Kiddush, okay? If I'm here for 40 years, that should be on, you know, whatever portrait they have of me.
The rabbi who brought back Kiddush.
The rabbi who brought back Kiddush, very important. We have, believe it or not, I'm certain, the same person who baked your challah rolls is still here. She still works here. Rabbi Tokayer, who wrote a book called The Fugu Plan, which is a sort of like this established tome of Jewish Japan relations. It's a long story. Anyway, he was the first rabbi here. Before that, it was all military chaplains. He was a military chaplain, and he came back to serve as the civilian rabbi. And he had some kids here. The person who baked your challah rolls and who continues to bake our challah rolls and was baking hamantashen today was the nanny for Rabbi Tokayer, and learned all the Jewish recipes from Rabbi Tokayer's mother-in-law, who was visiting. Ad hayom hazeh, until today, she still makes those same out of this world recipes that she refused. And she's 92, but she's been 92 for a long time, so nobody knows exactly what her age is. And she refuses to give up the recipes because once you have the recipes, you know, you get rid of me. We said, are you crazy? What?
As they say in Japanese, kane nahara.
Amen. So she should live and be well at Me'ava Esrim, and then more. I mean, Me'ava Esrim, I think, is for Jews. She should go well beyond.
Well, Rabbi Scheer, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us. It's been really fascinating and been lovely reconnecting and hearing about all the amazing work you've been doing in America and in Japan. And we look forward to hosting you at the Great Synagogue and coming over with your wife and your son and spending some time with us. And it'd be lovely to show you the delights of Sydney.
Absolutely. We would love that. You're all welcome to visit us in Tokyo. Bezrat Hashem very soon.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. Everyone have a good evening, and everyone be well. And there'll be another one of these discussions in a month's time. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you
Thank
again,
you.
Rabbi Elton.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the community. Wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you.
Rabbi, Rabbi,
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
I
sure.
just want to say, not related to this chat, but you mentioned that you had been in Nashville. We lived there for 26 years.
Were you at Shereth Israel?
Yeah. And Shereth Israel and Chabad. When were
Yes.
you there?
2013.
We had left already. We left at 2009. We were there from 1983 to 2009.
So, okay, we're going to do Jewish geography. Here we go. You remember Lewis? He ran a pharmacy.
Yes, of course.
Awesome guy. I stayed at his house a few times.
Yeah. The coaches, Moshe and Evelyn Coach.
Yeah, Moshe Kosh.
What?
Yeah. And Evelyn was the president when I was
Yeah.
the intern
That's
there.
right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a great artist, Moshe. I remember.
Yeah, and Daniela Presner and Rabbi were wonderful.
Oh, they
All
were already
wonderful.
there.
Still there.
Oh, wow. And his predecessor was, I mean, a larger than life rabbi.
Rabbi Posner.
Zalman Posner.
Zalman Posner.
Yeah.
53 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard he was incredible. And the Chaz was there. The cantor, the Chazan.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes. Lovely man.
only-
He retired recently.
Only recently, yeah.
I think he's working harder in retirement. I want you to know that.
I can imagine that. I can imagine that. He's a delightful gentleman.
Really nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Jewish geography.
Jewish geography. Well, thank you. That was
Thank
lovely.
you very much. Most fascinating.
Absolutely. Can't wait to see you in Tokyo or Sydney, whichever comes first.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. So long, everyone.